Hello and welcome to another Areopa webinar. My name is Starič and I'll be the moderator for today. Today's episode is already 108th and we have Jeremy Vyska with us to talk about Markdown's magical mermaid. This is a session I really wanted to see at Days of Knowledge Nordic, but unfortunately it was scheduled on the exact same slot as one of my sessions. So I'm very happy that Jeremy decided to redo it as one of the Areopa webinars. I'll let him have the floor in a couple of minutes, but just before I do that, let's go through a couple of housekeeping rules for today. Your microphone is muted and it's going to stay muted. If you've got any questions, pop them into the window, the GoToWebinar question window on the right side, and I'll pick them up. We agreed with Jeremy that we'll reserve the questions till he's done with his story, and then we'll go through everything that you might have on your mind. Just like every other webinar, this one is recorded as well and will be published on Areopa's YouTube channel, where you can also find all of the recordings from previous sessions. So check that out. If you'd like to know what's coming up, the best place is to be part of the Areopa webinars newsletter. You can find this on the link you see on the slide, but you can also find a way to subscribe on Areopa's website. To give you a bit of a sneak peek, what's still coming up until we finish up with season 6, we've got a session on July 7th with 7 or so AI killer prompts to change your daily life as a functional consultant by Jose. And 2 weeks later, on July 21st, we're going to have From OpenAPI to AL, auto-generating strongly typed REST API clients for Business Central with Kyoto by Simon and Tobias. These are going to be the last 2 sessions of season 6, but we're already planning an agenda for season 7, which is going to start in September. And if any of you would like to share one of your topics, we're always continuously looking for speakers. So feel free to reach out to me, to reach out to Luke, to reach out to anyone who's involved with Areopa, and we can get you scheduled for season 7. Now, just before I hand over to Jeremy, I'd like to thank our sponsor, ForNav, for allowing us to share all of these beautiful webinars with you. And with that, Jeremy, I'll make you the organizer and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you for the warm introduction. Yeah, absolutely. So as mentioned, this is a rerun a little bit of a Days of Knowledge Nordic 2025 from earlier this season, talking about Markdown's magical mermaid, which is a tongue twister and a half. Just to give a little bit of background for anyone watching now or in the future who don't know who I am, I've been doing Business Central work for 25 years or a little bit more, developer, consultant, trainer. I've written books about Business Central, been an MVP for a few years, a number of free and open source utilities for the community, including like newsletters of upcoming events and all sorts of blog post type things. So fun stuff. All right. Well, let's get into the real reason why we're here. So what Mermaid is, hopefully everyone here is familiar with Markdown, but let's just define it real quick. Markdown is a formatting language designed to be easy and lightweight, and then be able to be rendered into usually web pages, previews, and that sort of thing. Markdown is very pervasive. So for example, Markdown is used in Git repositories very frequently. So Azure DevOps, GitHub both heavily can use Markdown. And for those of you who don't know, Azure DevOps has that rich text control that you can format text and everything. That's actually going to be converting to Markdown as well from HTML that it currently is. So yeah, and Markdown is also very flexible. It's designed to be a little simpler to write. Think of it as HTML, but simpler. What Mermaid does is that it adds diagrams to Markdown. Mermaid is also pretty flexible. It's also pervasive. Almost everywhere that supports Markdown also supports Mermaid. And it's also designed to be really lightweight. And because I had gotten some sass about it, what it isn't, it is great for quick diagrams, and it is really great for code-driven or managed diagrams where you want to control versions of it evolving over time. The gotchas here is that sometimes it might feel a little too techy for people to use. You know, consultants who are used to just popping open PowerPoint or Visio to diagram something up might not feel as at home with the style of generating the document. And it does generate diagrams, and it generates them quick and it generates them simple, but it's never going to replace a graphic designer. You can make it pretty, but you really probably shouldn't spend the time on it, and it is not a Mermaid. I tried to actually look into for the talk what the story was on why did they call it Mermaid, and actually, as far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be any backstory to that. So hopefully I'll be able to chase that up and add that to a comment section somewhere. Okay, so the why this talk. First and foremost, the reason that this became a talk in the first place is because I've been using this a whole bunch in meetings to be able to very quickly, while we're talking about stuff, just whiteboard. Most of us have had to live in Teams and Zoom and on all sorts of other chat platforms for quite some time, and there are whiteboarding tools in those oftentimes, but they don't really replace the whiteboarding. So what I've gotten into the habit of is using Mermaid on screen to prepare and document things with people. And I get the question every time, what are you doing? How are you doing that? So almost everyone I had shown this to was fairly impressed with how easy it was to just add stuff to the diagramming. So that was the inciting incident. And then to get it approved for a conference session, you have to, provide more value, deliver more ROI, and all those, wonderful delve and deep dive type things. So how you can quickly validate ideas for your product and project teams, how you can help clients and partner channels by documenting the process flows, how to help fellow devs and future selves by documenting the code, troubleshooting workflows, and coding. It sounds all nice, but the fancy way of explaining that, which is really just pictures are worth 1,000 words. So let's be a little bit smart about using picture tools. So let's start with an easy example that is a fairly common workflow type situation where we might need to explore an idea. And I'm going to show the Mermaid first, and we'll talk through a little bit about what we're seeing on screen. So first of all, this is pretty easy to read. It's not super clear, but it's not bad. We are going to describe a sequence diagram. There are 3 participants, whatever that means, right? One's a website, one's an order clerk, and one's a logistics team. And when we kind of read through it, just in English, with just the way the punctuation's describing stuff, we can be like, okay, a website is doing something to pass over to an order clerk that we're going to submit a quote. The order clerk is, I guess, handing something to themselves where they're going to convert the quote to an order, they're going to release an order, and then that goes off to a logistics team to create a shipment, and the logistics team then posts a shipment. So it's very readable just as it is, which isn't bad. But if you were trying to identify where there might be a problem in this flow, this isn't easy to meet with a customer or product manager and describe it. But the nice thing is what Mermaid does is it takes that description right there and it generates this diagram from that. It understands the sequence flow that we've described here. It understands that there's these 3 different participants and that there are 5 different steps of operations that are happening. So this can be a really useful mechanism for visualizing where there might be a problem. And we're going to dive into a few of those a little bit more. But let's talk about what kind of diagrams, because this is one of many different types that are available to us. So let's look at what we've got here, which is the mermaid.js.org site. And I'm going to zoom this up a little bit so everyone can see a little bit better in the recording. The intro page here describes some general diagram types right off the bat. And we have flowcharts, some really basic flowchart examples here, A to B to C to D and all that fun stuff. What we were just looking at was a sequence diagram where we can describe the sequence of things that happen, and we can do a bunch of advanced stuff. We're going to go into some examples with that, but we can even do Gantt diagrams from this. We can do class diagrams from this, where we might be able to define some different classes that are going on. And one of my favorites, if you're working with a group of developers and you're trying to explain maybe branching strategies or those sort of things, there's a Git graph diagram in here where you can just very easily and quickly build a branching diagram to show commit histories and merges and that sort of thing. All of these have deeper diagrams behind them. So this is just an introductory sample for each, but we can also see we can do some entity relationship diagrams. We can see some user journeys. We can do some things that I don't know why you wouldn't do this in Excel, but maybe there's a good reason. Or you can do quadrants and you can do charts and all that sort of thing as well. There are some other options that aren't on the intro page that maybe you can do that are deeper dive, like you can do Kanban things, you can do timelines and all that wonderful stuff. Each of these has a wide array of possibilities to formatting them underneath, so you can work with things and do different diagramming types. And all of them are designed to be very easy to understand syntax. So that way, when you're looking at things, you can understand very quickly how to work with this. So yeah, that's one of the things I like an awful lot about Mermaid, is that there's a bunch of different diagram types. I don't have to click and drag node connectors. Historically, before I got used to using this, I would use PowerPoint Smart Art all the time for whiteboarding stuff. And now this is kind of my go-to. So the first, value point that I was talking about at our conference was validating ideas, data concepts, and processes. So an example of that might be a nice flowchart here, which again, this one's a little bit more complicated. We can see that this is a flowchart and that maybe there's some different things that are going to another thing. It's a little less clear what's going on when you're just reading it, because we're doing some really fun formatting things. And we can see that what this little markdown is describing is basically how data flows into a sales order. So when someone asks me a question where they say, oh, we really need this information to show up on the invoice, a diagram like this allows me to more quickly and simply show someone a quick picture that says, okay, you know what? To get that information on the invoice, it's got to come from somewhere. Where in this process do you want that information to come in? Is this per line info? Is that coming in because of items? Is that coming from a customer card? Those sort of elements. And it becomes very easy to explain to someone when you say, oh, I just want to add a field to the customer for a contract number that should print on the invoice. Well, why is it going to take you this much time to add the contract number to just these two places? I'm not adding them to these two places. I'm adding them to all of these many places. So there's a lot of visualization that lets you validate. These are some of the different places where I'm showing info. Next off, a process example. I love this one. This is similar to a discussion we had internally, building a PTE for one of our customers with one of our integrations. We see this is fairly similar to what we ran into earlier, where we're dealing with a sequence diagram, website, order clerk, manager, logistics team. And we can see this looks a little code-ish in that we kind of have like almost an if-else situation going on. And that's true. What this little diagram will show us is that we had a situation where a website was going to submit, someone would fill out something on a website that would generate a quote. The clerk would, convert that to an order, release it for approval. And well, depending on if the manager approved it, we had the clear workflow there, and they wanted to have approval processing, and they wanted the manager to be able to disapprove that. And we got to ask the question right in that first conversation of, well, if the manager hits disapprove and we're wanting to notify that website somehow, what's the correct mechanism? How do we know that we can get that info back to the website? And it became a very easy way to document what the customer had just described to us as a process, and to be able to raise that what if in that moment. As it turned out, this particular scenario, there was no way for the website to have some sort of disapproval notice coming to that. The order clerk would in fact need to notify the customer directly. So we were able to identify very early on in the thought process that there was actually going to be an out-of-scope item. There was no code that could handle that notified disapproval process. They needed to change their business practice to make sure that the order clerk knew that they had to handle that scenario. And anytime you can talk someone out of creating a code solution, you're in good shape, because the only code with no bugs is no code at all. And I am not referring to no code, low code type stuff. I just mean no code. If you don't change it, you can't have introduced bugs to it. So finding opportunities to ask those if questions early on is really valuable. In both of these cases, this is often something that I introduce in early discovery meetings when we're writing up requirement plans, any process changes. These are things that I put together. We use DevOps internally. These actually go right onto our DevOps work diagram as Mermaid. So that way, later on, we have some tracking to know exactly what diagram did they review and what did they approve of. And we'll see later how that comes into play in our development step. And that feeds right into document-driven development was one of the things I floated as a description. We all know Luke has his great talks that he gives on test development and all that fun stuff. But the beautiful thing here is that if we have gotten during the workflow and exploring the requirements process, if we got this exact workflow and we know what stuff is going to be customized, then when it comes time to write those tests, we also have explored all the permutations that we potentially need. And so in a fashion, this is almost before that wonderful Excel spreadsheet where we need to define all those scenarios. It allows us to visually surface for the client what sort of things are we going to have in our final document. So that's one of the ways that we can help clients out a little bit, and we can also help our partners. As you can see by this little tiny bit of Mermaid, this is a flowchart, and this is a simplified example that I came up with for this talk to explain the concept of a bridge app for one of our customers that had two different solutions from AppSource that needed to work together. How could we have two AppSource apps work together without having dependencies on each other, because they're third-party apps and we can't do that? Well, we do a bridge app that does dependency injection. And so it was very easy for us to describe for our customer situation and to be able to describe for our partners, where we created internally for our products bridge apps to connect our different applications together. How did that work? What was the architecture behind these two different solutions working together? And you can see that this is relatively straightforward and pretty helpful. Another place where this comes into really, really big help, and I strongly recommend you develop this practice internally, is almost all your code is in a repo somewhere, I hope. Well, I also hope that your README in that repo is a really great onboarding document that when a developer starts to work with your solution, all the information they need to get started, or at least to have the groundwork, is in that README file. And this is a wonderful place where you can introduce Markdown to help them out. So for example, we have the possibility of doing solution design. We can talk through what are like some of the key principles in the README, less a Mermaid thing, more of a Markdown thing, but you can also describe key processes. So one of the great examples in solution design is just a dependency tree. If you develop a lot of PTEs for customers and those PTEs are broken up into individual apps, well, wouldn't it be nice to understand how the dependency structure is? I think so. And because the dependency graphs on this are in Mermaid, which is just Markdown, which is just plain text, there are lots of ways to generate just plain text. So, for example, Waldo has his AL language extension that helps people rename files to follow a standard. I gave him last month this little PowerShell script that I hope he brings into his Visual Studio Code solution that basically just goes through a project path, scans all of the app JSONs, and it actually builds a Mermaid diagram throughout the whole process. And if we can see down here, this will actually produce a markdown that can describe your dependency infrastructure. So this PowerShell script, you can just grab off of this GitHub issue and run it directly yourself. You don't have to wait for Waldo to include it. But this produced straight from the app JSON, a clear architecture of everything that was involved in this application. This can be a really great way to identify circular dependencies. This can be a really great way to look at if you have version skew issues and that sort of thing. If we zoom in on this a little bit, this PowerShell script highlights all of the individual dependencies with clear version tags. And this just pulls it straight out of the JSON. If we copy and paste that, we can see that it's actually just a big giant bit of Markdown. It's a graph. Nothing too elaborate. We have a lot of different arrows in that diagram, as everyone saw. So this is describing all those arrows, but it's pretty useful. We've used this internally for most of our products at this point to describe some of the different operational flows and some of the key processes of how these solutions work together, and to understand key operations in the workflow. One thing that I do want to mention is that all of these things, because they're just Markdown, it becomes very easy to ask AI tools to use it. I know there's always that moment of, is this going to be a pro AI session or a not pro session? There are valuable places where you can make use of it. And this is actually, for me, one of those great places where we can, because it becomes very easy to ask Mermaid to ask copilots to generate Mermaid text for you. It absolutely does understand all of these different pieces. So it's something that's worth exploring, that you can potentially make use of all of those different elements. So, and in the key processes, there are lots of different ways that you can take advantage of documenting how everything should work. And let me open up a file. I'm going to share an internal doc on YouTube. Always nice, right? In one of our products, for example, and don't worry, this is a branch where I haven't downloaded symbols, so we have a million problems that are unrelated. In Visual Studio Code, if we have a lovely README file that contains Mermaid, we can preview that in Visual Studio Code, and it has no problem rendering the Markdown for us here. So if we want to understand the processes that an application does to handle all of the data flow, well, that's just lovely little sequence diagrams. And because this is basic formatting stuff that is in plain text, you can check that into your repo just along with like everything else. So it's pretty phenomenal for that. So I would say document your solution design, which could be how apps depend on each other. It could be how events are triggering off of each other. You can put in place all of the key processes that a new developer should always understand to look at, what if scenarios. For example, here we've got, when a receiver is working with a handler, if things work well, if things don't work well, what should we do? What should happen in those different scenarios? So the more you can put those principles into your internal documentation, the more the next person along, or you in 2 years, when you look at this code again and wonder what the heck was I thinking, have a hint. So give yourself a little bit of a chance. There's the natural and easy question of is there an easy way to edit this that doesn't involve, just knowing the syntax? So let's look at the editor here. If you go to Mermaid Live, let me clear this one out, I think. Yeah. If you go to mermaid.live, this will open up the Mermaid Live editor, and they have some easy buttons down here to give you some example diagrams of some of the common types that they would encourage. And this editor panel here works very much like a Visual Studio Code type editor, in that you can do all the lovely keyboard shortcuts that you're used to. So if you want to do your lovely multi-cursor type thing and you wanted to modify the various pipes that are involved, I don't recall the syntax off my top of my head either, you can absolutely do all of those things, including Control F, Control H to do all your find replace. It's a very light Visual Studio Code editor. And it gives you some different examples that you can jump off of. You'll see here we've got some very basic diagrams. We could, and it of course, supports all of the autocomplete here. Let's say John to Alice. Don't forget to say goodbye. And there we go. So we can add some different sequence components to all of these different pieces. And they, of course, want you to sign up and all those lovely things, but it's free. So there are many different examples in here. The docs you can jump right off to, and this is a great way to be able to grab these screenshots. So this is typically what I will have open in like a Teams meeting or a Zoom call, whatever have you, where if you need to understand the sequence flow, it becomes very simple to add some pieces to this. I do hope that they think a little bit about adding some more nice buttons to this, but here in the actions, you can just save that as a PNG. You can copy the markdown on that, or you can just copy the text and send it off to somebody. So it becomes very, very easy to share these diagrams and to save them, and you can specify your targets and all that fun stuff. So definitely worth playing with. You probably noticed that when I did encourage people in my talk to try out a Mermaid add-in for Visual Studio Code. There is some things that are official editors for this, but it's mostly to enable some AI-powered diagramming. And honestly, mostly what this does is it works with GitHub Copilot to add even more diagrams and to add more awareness of diagrams. So where this came in, just to show a wonderful example, is at BC Tech Days, I had demonstration code that I showed in a performance and job queue session where we were doing a very common processing job of some sort of queue table where we grabbed information from a web shop. We potentially created customers. We might create ship tos. We would create sales orders. We would create lines. We might check stock, create some supporting documents, and do some other operations. Now, if I were a new person to this project, I would be a little bit lost because not only does this code have a ton of logging stuff going on in here, but it also calls some different job queue or code unit based things, which are all of these separate code units, which, you know, some of these are, 1,000-line long code units. So some of these are pretty big. I would find as a new programmer or as someone trying to troubleshoot or help with this code unit and its ancillary processes a little bit difficult to work with and a little bit challenging to understand. So shortly before today's session, I said, you know what, let me put Copilot to the test on this. And I said, okay, I opened up the code unit in question. I said, this code unit does a lot of things. Can you do a Mermaid flowchart of the top level process and then a separate sequence Mermaid for each sub-step? And what it did, and it took a couple minutes because it was reading all the code and everything, is that it analyzed the code unit I was looking at and then found all of the validation and processing steps that it was doing and read each of those processing code units. As a result of that, wonderful little prompt, nothing too crazy. And I know Tine does all sorts of great talks about prompts, but I did a nice lazy typical prompt and I was kind of open with it. This gave me a markdown diagram that I could turn right into a README file without too much fuss and bother. Here's my top level process flow. And we can see here that it's doing a flow chart showing start, and then we have these validation routines and all that stuff. It went a little fancier than I would have bothered with random, ice sorbet coloring things. Sure, that's nice. That's not bad. And then here are my lovely sequence diagrams where I can see, okay, well, we're going to do a call to logging. We're going to do a filter on this web queue. And if there's nothing found, then we'll do this logging routine. If we found some orders, then we'll log that we're starting. And then we do this loop process for each order in this web queue table. We're going to run this web queue validate. And if validation fails, we'll set the status to error, we'll set the error message, and we'll log it. If validation succeeds, we'll just update it to validated. And once we're all done with that loop, we'll log that we're all done. That to me is a heck of a lot easier to read if I was trying to debug, did I have the right logic in place? So one of my developer habits that I've gotten into quite often is asking Copilot for summaries of code that I've written to see if I've just thought through all of my handling correctly. And this can be a very, very valuable diagnostic and self-validation process for you. And we could see that here it went through and it did the next step where we were doing some validation processes. And then this one, it said, you know what, there's too many yes-no scenarios. I don't think sequence is actually what you want. I actually think what you really want is a flowchart. And it overrode my request to say, I don't want to do a sequence diagram. So, and it's kind of useful because it is correct in that, and I left some of the errors in Copilot's generation. It put some line feeds in here that didn't render correctly. Okay, sure. But if the customer exists, yes, then use that. If no, use that. So this became a really simple way for me to generate a complete understanding of what this code unit is supposed to be doing. And here, when we're doing the create sales line, we have this whole inventory management subsection where we're checking the inventory for each line about the stock level. We're checking overstock. If we have to do these other processes, it really understood how to generate these. And this becomes a very, very simple way to pop all of this stuff into a README now that explains what is this all about. The flip side to this is that, well, Copilot can also read these diagrams. Copilot's not so great at reading Visio and PowerPoint and all those other diagramming tools. So not only can now I save this and use this, and when I check this into a DevOps or a GitHub, it'll render on the web just nicely, no problem. One, if anyone changes this diagram, I have source control over it. Two, if I need Copilot to consider all of this process and these rules and any changes it's suggesting to me, anytime I chat with it from now on, well, I can just add the context and include that diagram. And it will understand now everything I just taught it about that diagram, and I don't have to worry about it understanding what was the process I was going for. So now a lot of times when I describe thinking it through, when I am meeting with a customer, I'm doing a live mock-up of the process and all the things that are necessary for that process right in that first call. I can then use that in my test-driven development to easily copy and paste this Mermaid into my workspace, include that for context, and now I can have my Copilot helping me generate the tests and the general scaffolding of the actual application itself from the thing that we looked at in that meeting. And then later, when I'm trying to support it 2 or 3 years down the road and I don't remember the project anymore, I can just look at it at a glance and go, oh yeah, that's right. This was where we had the crazy stock thing where they wanted to do overstock, and now they've added a third location. So now we have to update the overstock process because they've just expanded on us. And even though they swore up and down they would never have a second location for overstock, well, never came faster than we expected. So being able to glance at this and see that right from the get-go would allow me to diagnose it a lot faster. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And I kind of spoke to it just then a little bit. Debugging some different pieces is something I use it for. I had an example for one of our customers. They recently had asked us the question of, we want to have gain losses between specific bank accounts go to specific GL accounts. The problem is that the currency adjustment routine in Business Central, the gains and losses are set at the currency level. It doesn't matter what bank accounts are involved. There's no way to connect those things. And I explained internally to my teammate that, in fact, we can do that, but we have to do that through the eventing, and we can override the gains and loss accounts. And he said, that's pretty cool, but I'm not sure I understand like all of your conditions here that you're doing where you're saying, you know, if this, then exit, if this, then exit. A very test near, test far for the older developers in the crowd who appreciate the old patterns. They're still good. I very simply asked it to please represent this little procedure here in Mermaid. And I had to add to my prompt, don't just use the code for the steps, re-summarize them. And it gave me this lovely little flowchart here, which if we copy and paste this off into our Mermaid diagram, a Mermaid editor, it's not bad. It's a little hard to read. Here we've got it doing a flowchart top down. I'm going to change that to left to right, so that way I can kind of have a better sense of it. And now when I'm meeting with my fellow developer, it becomes easier for me to say, okay, so what this procedure is doing is it's first checking, is the bank account posting group empty? If it is, get out of here. We don't have to do anything. If it isn't, then can we get it? Yes. Is the gain account set? No. Then we'll set it, and we'll set is handled to true. So it became really easy to see, is there a fault in my logic? Is there somewhere where an if statement wasn't being handled? Is there somewhere where we're exiting where we're not supposed to be? So one of the things that we've been using Mermaid for internally is just, well, I hope everyone here is familiar with rubber duck debugging, but realistically, Copilot, it can be a phenomenal rubber duck. Rephrase this and explain it into clear steps means that it is able to take a lot of these conditionals and put it in plain language. So you can use it to sanity check your own code, if that makes sense. All right, yeah, so that was an example of that one. All right, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I would specifically cover. Oh, yes. There was also a lovely piece in my Tech Days talk towards the end. Hopefully those will be going online for not too distant future for folks. But we had a scenario where we were demonstrating performance. And I showed in my session on Tech Days that we actually could use the Gantt chart to show a version of the processing flow that we were looking at, the one we had just diagrammed the many different steps. I was showing how you could break that up and spread that across multiple job queues as part of parallel operations. And this was a rendered version of a Markdown language. It looks a little crazy on the left-hand side, for sure. But we have a nice visual representation of how some of the operations were happening. And this is actually generated in Business Central. So let's see if my Docker is cooperating. Fingers crossed, everyone. I have rebooted since we ran this, and that's always a gamble with Docker, right? In the demonstration I did at Tech Days, we were logging the data operations internally. I wanted to have it be not in telemetry so we could demonstrate it in client. And so we were logging a bunch of different operations, and I had this lovely little button in here to generate the chart. And this gave me my Gantt that we were just looking at. And this is just AL code turning a log entry set into a diagram for us. So if we close up everything so we can see things, and this is available on GitHub already. So if the talk isn't available yet, the code certainly is. This little Mermaid generator code unit is taking a set of logging entries in a log table, my Turbo app demo log entry, and it's just generating how long each of these different operations took. And then based on those different operations, it's creating lines in my Mermaid documentation. Let's see, we can jump down here. This, for example, is building our little Gantt header, and then we generate the Gantt from our buffer. So just using AL inside of my product, I could easily generate diagnostic info to go, which process is running slow? Well, validating is going nice and fast. Processing is slow. That makes sense. Sure. So I'm a big proponent of telemetry and being able to do diagnostic information off of telemetry data, but sometimes you've already got logging info. You've already got entries inside of Business Central. So wouldn't it be nice to just be able to see inside of Business Central the data? I will potentially look at if I can make like a community source HTML viewer that would let you render this right inside of BC. But for simplicity for my demo, it's just a copy paste thing. And we can see that the processing cycle finishes and then all the rest of the processes are easy. So this was a great example of we can see what steps are causing our slowdown in our operation. And this is just, again, Mermaid. It's very basic text data that gets rendered nicely into visuals. So that about is the talk. I guess we can segue nicely onto questions.
Perfect. And we already have one lined up, and then I also have two of them. The first one is coming from Christian Lens. Is it possible to convert existing diagrams like draw.io diagrams to the Mermaid format? Or would you recommend to rebuild them in Mermaid and possibly rethink the structure?
I haven't attempted to redo some of the .io style diagrams into Mermaid. However, because both of those are open sourcey ways of documenting code, I would say that there are probably ways that Copilot would be able to assist with that effort. Draw.io and a couple of the other .io style flowchart diagramming tools allow a lot more granular control. So I will say that my experience of, say, flowcharts like this, if I just wanted to space these out a little bit more and reshape them, in the draw.io platforms, that is much, much easier than in Mermaid. This is very describe it and I'll render it for you, but that's kind of about it. However, you can, if you need to just tweak it a little bit, switch it over into playground mode. In playground mode, you can adjust some of the diagrams with some drawing, and it will understand a little bit of click, drag, and drop. But if I just wanted to scooch this out a little bit, I don't think it's as good at letting me adjust some of the different pieces. So let's see, I think it was whiteboard mode. Negative. All right. So I would say play around with playground mode and see if then you can improve your diagrams the way you're looking for, and you might be able to get some of the results that the draw.ios are. I will check and add to the YouTube video if there are any specialized converters between the two and share those as well.
I'd be curious if you just took a screenshot and threw it into GitHub Copilot, if it would already recognize enough parts.
Ooh, that sounds exciting. I will say that even though I demonstrated with GitHub Copilot, the Microsoft 365 Copilot, ChatGPT, all of those understand Mermaid just fine, and I've been able to use all of those different tools just fine. I think one of my favorites was I took meeting notes from Teams Copilot, dropped that into a Word doc, fed that into Microsoft Copilot, and said, please describe this in Mermaid diagrams in a Markdown file. And it read through, broke those apart into 3 separate diagrams because we had 3 different sequences.
Nice. I had one question, if there's any tools that would allow me to draw the diagram through UI and generate the code, but you've just shown the playground mode, and I think that's exactly what I was missing before.
Yeah. So I would say my experience is that the playground mode doesn't always work exactly as I expect it to, like moving things around and adjusting pieces. You'll see that, for example, I'm trying to drag this off 2 places and instead it's giving me new nodes. So like if you're trying to just get things to be just so, it can result in some really weird visuals because all it's doing on the left-hand side is updating the Mermaid diagram text. So, but it can be nice to go, if you need to do some specific diagram elements that maybe aren't always obvious of exactly how they should work, you have some abilities to add images and icons and those sort of things too.
I like it because when I played with Mermaid before, I didn't have a clue what it offers, and this can be a nice way into, okay, these are the possibilities of what I can use. But
Absolutely.
we now have also an opposite question, which is it possible to export a Mermaid chart as a Visio?
Ah, interesting. I don't know. That's a good question. I know that there was PNG and SVG, but I don't know if Mermaid natively can go over to Visio. So that's a good question.
That was
So I'm not sure yet.
by David Singleton. And now we have one question from Arthur. Arthur, I have no clue what what this stands for, but do you use a WYSIWYG editor during a Teams call, or all by code, or a combination of both?
A WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get editor, which is
Okay.
kind of what we're looking at here. So yeah, like for example, we can start here with a blank flowchart and describe what we're looking for, or I could swap this over to a sequence diagram, and then we can, as you can see, when we tell it that we're going to do a sequence diagram, it actually changes the toolbar as well. So we can add a new participant, and we'll pick on Arthur. So we've now got the Arthur participant, and he's going to pass stuff over to Stefan, working on some code cop stuff. And now we could potentially do some operations, I believe, where we can now say, all right, we're going to add this operation here. And in fact, it's going to go over to Arthur. Arthur's passing it to Stefan of validate the pull request. So typically this would be how I would often use it in like the real-time mode when I'm just doing meetings. So I take a lot of kind of notes as I go, and then we'll just show my screen and be like, is this what you mean?
Cool. Okay. Another question from Christian. Do you have any experience with visualizing the folder or namespace structure of an app to check if the code structure reflects the original design?
I haven't tried that specifically yet, but my experience is that if you're working with any of the coding assistant language AI type things, they're really good at understanding folder infrastructure and that sort of thing and re-describing what they found. And, as mentioned, it's absolutely something that if you have commonly, frequently needed things like I did with the dependency graph, you can absolutely do that in PowerShell as well to, like, if you've got maybe 100 or several hundred internal PTEs and you just want to very quickly create a folder full of Mermaid files that describe all of those projects, so you could quickly flip through all of the graphics and go, do these all look right? We're human, and just glancing at a picture, we can usually pick up problems easier than we can a folder structure. So I've absolutely written some PowerShell scripts like this where it was validating workspace files, git ignore files, and those sort of things, generating a big resulting Mermaid set of diagrams that then I could just flip through each of the files and eyeball it at a glance and go, yeah, that does what it's supposed to. So you could probably do something similar with folder and file infrastructure, and just have PowerShell spit out your diagram as a result for you.
One thing that I would add, if anyone's using Statical Prism, I know we all used it back in the CAL days, but they've just released an update where they started visualizing namespaces, which might be worth looking into. And another question, this time from Christian. Are there best practices for integrating visual workflows via Mermaid directly into GitHub README files or wikis used in Business Central projects?
I don't know if there are any best practices around that yet. I think we, as a group of people interested in this, can start to decide some of those best practices. But I know internally for all of our apps, we've now been internally adding core processes that match in the same way that you would have testability checking all of your core processes, we want to have documentation that describes all of our core processes and notes where we have eventing or extensibility, so that partners we work with, we can easily supply that diagram to partners and say, this is where we're extensible and what you can do with our solution. For our PTE ecosystem, dependencies are usually more the thing, and being able to generate those dependency charts very quickly and have those in the README file has been probably the most valuable.
Okay, I think, yeah, that's the last of the questions. So with that, I'm going to take over the screen control. I want to first, invite everyone to the remaining 2 webinars of the current season. But I also want to just say first a big thank you to you, Jeremy, for sharing your Mermaid knowledge with us. But also thank you to everyone who's been watching this webinar, and thank you to the team that handles these webinars. It's not just the moderator. There's a lot of people being involved in the whole production. And we also have a couple of thank you and very helpful comments in the question bar. So Jeremy, I think you really did a great job. So with that, this is the end of today's webinar, and see you all in the upcoming ones.